All right, Chapter 33, 1933 to 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War. All right, most Americans in the 1930s tried to turn their backs on world problems. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt kind of shared those same views, realizing that a lot of his efforts were going to have to go towards a fight against the Great Depression. But cost of foreign involvement just simply seemed too great. And as a result, the United States maintained, for the most part, a policy of neutrality. But obviously, we know that won't last. The 66 nation London Economic Conference met in the summer of, or was to meet in the summer of 1933. The delegates to the London Conference hoped to organize a coordinated international attack on the global depression, really trying to stabilize the value of the various nations' currencies and the rates at which they could be exchanged, because exchange rate stabilization was really essential to world trade, and that was kind of gone just about at this time. Roosevelt at first plans to send a delegation to the conference, but soon begins to have second thoughts about it and eventually pulls out, mostly because he feared an international agreement to maintain the value of the dollar in terms of other currencies might tie his hands, and he was unwilling to sacrifice the possibility of domestic recovery for the sake of international cooperation. Roosevelt's attitude here plunges the planet even deeper into economic crisis and strengthens the global trend toward extreme nationalism, making international cooperation even more difficult during the 1930s. And this kind of plays into the hands of dictators around the world. The Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934 provided for the independence of the Philippines after a 12-year period of economic and political tutelage by the United States, of course, which meant its freedom would come in 1946. The United States would pull out of its army bases, but naval bases were reserved for future discussion as well as future retention. Roosevelt makes at least one internationalist gesture when he formally recognizes the Soviet Union in 1933. He's motivated in part by the hope for trade with the Soviet Union, as well as a desire to kind of bolster a friendly counterweight to the possible threat of German power in Europe and Japanese power in Asia. Then late in 1933, at the Seventh Pan American Conference, Roosevelt will kind of issue his policy of good neighbor. Really kind of suggested that the U.S. was kind of giving up its ambition to be a world power. Roosevelt was kind of more eager to kind of save money based on the lack of money in the Depression, and kind of eager to line up Latin Americans to help defend the Western Hemisphere if need be. As a result, the last of the Marines are going to depart Latin America, and Cuba is also released from the worst parts of that Platt Amendment, even though the United States would retain its naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Congress will pass the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934, a measure aimed at both relief and recovery, activating a lower tariff policy. What it would do is whittle down some of the worst parts of the Hawley-Smoot tariff and give Roosevelt the power to lower existing rates by as much as 50%, provided that other countries involved were willing to kind of do the same thing, reciprocate. During this time period, U.S. foreign trade, Secretary of State Cordell Hull will kind of increase trade with other countries, which was good for America. And the Reciprocal Trade Agreement was really considered a landmark piece of legislation, as it kind of reverses the traditional high protective tariff policy, as well as paving the way for American-led free trade international economic systems that would take shape after World War II. All right, post-1918 chaos in Europe, followed by, of course, the Great Depression, really kind of brought about a very ominous spread of totalitarianism in Europe. The individual was really nothing. The state was everything. The communist USSR, Soviet Union, led the way with the crafty and ruthless Joseph Stalin. Benito Mussolini, the swaggering fascist, seized the reins of power in Italy during 1922. And Adolf Hitler, a fanatic with the old toothbrush mustache, plotted and his way into control of Germany by 1933 with the liberal use of what was called the Big Lie. Hitler, by the way, was considered by most historians to be the most dangerous of dictators because he combined that tremendous power with such impulsiveness. Something to keep in mind too, 1933, Hitler withdraws from the League of Nations, and then 1936 forms the Rome-Berlin Axis between himself and Mussolini. And interestingly, by 1935, Japan quits the League of Nations, and then a number of years, about 5 years later, joins with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. Mussolini will then, in 1935, attack Ethiopia. Ethiopia will put up a kind of a brave fight as they kind of are attacked or attack with nothing but spears. Mussolini will easily crush the Ethiopians. But the League of Nations could have caused Mussolini to really stop if they had just taken the step to literally place an embargo on oil to them, but they didn't. So it shows a weakness, a real weakness of the League. Isolationists also nurse some real bitter memories of an ungrateful and defaulting debtors from World War I. So in 1934, Congress passes the Johnson Debt Default Act, which prevented debt-dodging nations from borrowing further in the United States. Interestingly, again, this sounded good for isolationists, but it's kind of a head in the sand thinking, as some of the Neutrality Acts we'll talk about were as well. Really will let the have-not powers become have powers eventually. Really kind of fearing that if all this borrowing of money would eventually kind of draw the United States into another war then too. All right, Senate committee headed by the gentleman, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota, is appointed to investigate what was known or called the blood business back from World War I. And kind of what these senators kind of get at is they start to shift the blame away from the German submarines onto American bankers and arms manufacturers. And of course, naive citizens kind of look illogically at this conclusion that these businesses, these bankers and manufacturers had really caused the war in order to make money. This kind of reasoning suggested that if the profits could only be removed from arms traffic, the country could steer clear away from any world conflict in the future. And then, responding to that pressure, Congress will make haste to legislate the nation out of war, as a result of or actions brought about by Mussolini attacking Ethiopia, they will pass the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and another one of 1937. Again, all these Neutrality Acts basically stipulated that when the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically go into effect. No American could legally sail on a belligerent ship, sell or transport munitions to a belligerent, or make loans to a belligerent. And again, this really this head in the sand legislation marked an abandonment of traditional policy of freedom of the seas. And they were specifically tailored to keep our nation out of a conflict like World War I. All right, the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 was really kind of the proving ground and dress rehearsal for World War II. An object lesson in the folly of neutrality by legislation, as the Spanish rebels rose against that Republican government, which was headed by fascist General Francisco Franco, and he was generously aided by his fellow conspirators, Hitler and Mussolini. And sadly, the United States sat on the sidelines while Franco, abundantly supplied with arms and men by his fellow dictators, strangled the Republican government of Spain, and the U.S., again, determined to stay out of war, they helped to condemn a fellow democracy to death. And regarding neutrality here, the United States actually declines to kind of build up its armed forces. They kind of had the idea that huge fleets cause huge wars. And also, basically, the government was trying to spare the taxpayers during this time of Great Depression, trying to spare them all that money. In 1937, the Japanese militarists invade China. In a sense, this attack was really the curtain call of World War II. And by refusing to call the China incident an officially declared war, Roosevelt puts those existing restrictions into effect. He would have actually cut off munitions to China that they needed, but fortunately, because he doesn't declare it a war, he's able to aid China with guns and trade at that time. So he pulls kind of a fast one there on the Congress and isolationists. And then in Chicago, Roosevelt delivers what is called his quarantine speech in 1937. In this speech, he called for positive endeavors to quarantine the aggressors, presumably with economic embargoes. Isolationists feared that a moral quarantine would lead to a shooting quarantine, but Roosevelt really sought a less direct means to curb those dictators. In December 1937, Japanese aviators bombed and sank an American gunboat, the Panay, But they will quickly, hastily apologize and pay a proper indemnity, and America kind of forgives them for that. Adolf Hitler, meanwhile, kind of grows bolder and bolder by the moment in Europe. In 1936, he's going to march into the demilitarized German Rhineland. And while France and Britain kind of look on in indecision, Hitler soon undertakes to persecute and also exterminate the Jewish population in areas that are under his control as well during this time. And then suddenly in 1938, Hitler occupies German-speaking Austria, which happens to be his birthplace, and makes demands for German-inhabited Sudetenland of neighboring Czechoslovakia. And of course, the leaders of Britain and France, kind of eager to appease Hitler, try to bring him to the conference table to try to work that out. That conference is finally held in Munich, Germany in September 1938. The Western European democracies basically betrayed Czechoslovakia to Germany when they consented to the shearing away of this Sudetenland. Interestingly, the Prime Minister of England makes the bold statement when he gets back to England that in this conference, he literally brought peace to our time. And one interesting individual who didn't believe that at all is a guy by the name of Winston Churchill. Appeasement, just a word to kind of get in there too. Appeasing the dictators really kind of was a word that came out of Munich here, really kind of turned out to be a surrender on the old installment plan. Because obviously 6 months later, Hitler really takes all of Czechoslovakia, contrary to his vows in the Munich conference that he wouldn't. In the Soviet Union, interestingly then, astounds the world by signing in 1939 a non-aggression treaty with Hitler, which becomes the notorious Hitler-Stalin Pact, meant that Nazi Germany could really had the green light to make war on Poland and the Western democracies without fearing a stab in the back from the Soviet Union. The interesting thing about this is that Stalin really had the plan, or was plotting to turn his German accomplice against Western democracies here, figuring that they would go to war and it would leave Stalin all alone to kind of take over and become the Colossus of Europe. And then 1939, Hitler finally does invade Poland. And of course, that pushes France and Britain to finally declare war against Germany. And of course, Stalin receives his portion of old Russian Poland from his non-aggression pact. So the Neutrality Act of 1939 allowed ill-prepared Europe to really buy arms from the United States, but on a cash and carry status, which really meant that they had to come over to the United States, buy the stuff with cash, and then they themselves had to take it back to Europe. Again, the United States figured if we were going to take it over, or we were going to do it, it would draw us into the war, and this was the way they kind of thought we could help them. But it wasn't it wasn't just Europe. It had to be the belligerents too. And unfortunately, France and England kind of control the seas. And as a result, those aggressors couldn't get their ships to buy American munitions either. And so Hitler kind of looks at this as America's not really neutral in this at all. This to Hitler was an unneutral neutrality act. All right, in April 1940, Hitler makes a mad dash through parts of Europe, invading Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And by June, well, France is forced to surrender. And in a very desperate but successful evacuation from the French port of Dunkirk, the British managed to pretty much salvage the bulk of their disarmed army, known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. And really, the only thing between Hitler and the world now was Britain. In the meantime, back in the United States, Congress finally kind of wakes up a little bit and starts to pass measures to try to prepare for war. In other words, a preparedness measure, about $37 billion to kind of get going here. They also, 1940, Roosevelt's going to talk Congress into a conscription law, which becomes the first peacetime draft, with the goal of trying to train about 1 million or so men per year. Then at a Havana conference, it was decided there that Germany could not take over any orphaned U.S. colonies, and the United States would take that as a kind of a direct attack then as well. And then in the Battle of Britain, this is really Hitler's attempt to kind of bring amazing destruction and chaos in Europe, planning in preparation for a land invasion. During those months of the Battle of Britain, the United States really kind of gets into a large debate with regard to what kind of foreign policy to embrace. And so you've got a kind of a non-isolationist and an isolationist group here. An isolationist group would be America First Committee Against the War. Their message was pretty plain and simple: the Yanks are not coming. And countering that is the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. They definitely sided with the idea that we needed to prepare for war. FDR makes another change in neutrality here. In 1940, he agrees to transfer about 50 old model 4 funnel destroyers left over from World War I in return for British, for I think 8 British defensive base sites stretching from Newfoundland to South America. And again, the controversy was really in the idea that this was really a flagrant violation of our neutral obligations. In the election of 1940, obviously, as things were heating up around the world, and especially explosive in Europe, it was really noted that a tried leader was needed in this election. The Republicans are going to nominate Wendell Willkie, and the Democrats obviously are going to convince Roosevelt to another term. FDR wins again, shattering the old 2-term idea. Democratic majorities in Congress pretty much remained about the same, which probably helps him as we prepare for war. And really, his true opponent in this election really wasn't Willkie. It was probably more Adolf Hitler. And then comes Lend-Lease Act, which, yes, breaks neutrality for the United States, but Lend-Lease is probably one of the most momentous laws ever to pass Congress. It was really a challenge hurled squarely at Axis dictators. You have America really now pledging itself of its vast resources to help defend aggression. And by the time all is said and done, America will send about $50 billion worth of arms and equipment, more than the cost of World War I for us, to nations fighting the aggression. And kind of the idea behind that is send guns, not sons, billions, not bodies. Roosevelt here promised he would be the arsenal of democracy. And so what America does is they lend supplies to the Allies, and in the understanding that they would return it later. So lend, at least. This gets attacked, interestingly, this gets attacked quite a bit, actually, by Senator Taft. This is former President Taft's son, who's a senator now from Ohio. Kind of like saying, hey, I'm going to give my neighbor a piece of gum, let him chew it, and then he's bound to give it back to me. And so that was kind of the idea put out behind what's this Lend-Lease all about. It really does gear our factories for all-out war production. And of course, Hitler sees the Lend-Lease as a real declaration of war. And so Germany starts bombing U.S. ships, such as the Lehigh and also the Robin Moore. And then Hitler makes one of the most probably confusing moves in his years as the Führer of Germany. He attacks the USSR and breaks that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Problem there, first of all, it's a 3-point attack into Germany, 3 different major cities there, industrial cities. And they make massive gains into Russia until very early and extremely cold winters come down upon the Soviet Union. And that literally will slow the Germans down. And as they run into problems, Hitler continues to change his mind about giving supplies to his armies there. And that becomes very detrimental. Meanwhile, what happens behind the scenes is Churchill and Roosevelt will meet secretly in the Atlantic and put together what's called the Atlantic Charter. And in the Atlantic Charter, they call for a stronger League of Nations, which will eventually, what they were talking about was the United Nations, and putting all of that together. So really trying to make the place a better world, really, again, focusing on Wilson's old 14 points. So you also, as U.S. ships escort British munitions across the Atlantic, Germany is going to start shooting those things down. And 1941, Congress finally says enough of the Neutrality Act, and they start arming merchant ships. Then in the Asian side of things, Japan is really kind of stalling diplomatically with the United States here. And then eventually what finally happens is Washington imposes an embargo on Japan in 1940. And that embargo is on things like aluminum, steel, oil, things like that. And hoping that Japan would either knuckle under the United States, or they'd probably be attacking some of the oil supplies of Southeast Asia. And in essence, what they do is they devise a plan to bomb our biggest naval station at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which FDR, capitalizes on by saying a date that will live in infamy. It becomes kind of one of the famous quotes right after that happens. And of course, Congress doesn't take long to offer him a declaration of war. And the interesting thing about this too is that this sneak attack really kind of aroused the United and united the United States as really just about nothing else could have done. And of course, that brings the United States into the war, and we'll talk more about that in the next. So that wraps up chapter 33, and I hope you guys enjoyed that these weren't plain white slides.